Hello. Today I'm talking with my colleague Rainer Hanekamp about testing strategies for standalone components. We look into the default options that ship with Angular, and then we look into some advanced stuff like the component test runner that ships with Cypress and the testing library. Hi, Rainer.
Hello, Manfred, and hello to everybody who's listening, watching. Hi.
Recently, we talked a lot about standalone components and we are really excited about them. And today, the big question is how can we test them? Do you have some answers for us?
Yes. So I hope so. I hope so. So there is this wonderful article of yours, and based on that, I would say we just take a look what the application more or less is doing, and then we just check out I would say, the native testing approaches, and then afterwards we are coming to the more advanced ones where we are using third-party libraries. Sounds like a plan. Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, sounds like a plan. Let's share your screen.
Okay.
So as you mentioned, the article was written by my lesser self and you have been the reviewer.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, so here we go.
Right. Yeah. So maybe I just start with showing the application so that we all have a picture about what it is doing. So it's a normal Angular application, I would say, and it's the typical Manfred application with a flight search. So what you can do here is that you have here two form controls. You can type in a from and the to as values, and then you just click on search. I mean, I have already done it here, but if I start again, then we are just getting the search results shown as a so-called flight card, which is a separate component. Yeah, so that's more or less what we want to test about this application. And I would say let's dive into the code. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we have here the normal of the flight search, the component itself. As we see, it is using kind of two dependencies. It's using the store, so it's using ngrx in that sense, and it is also using the activated root, which used to become from the router module, but these days it's the provide router. Okay, and we see already that we have here already 4 different testing files, and I would say I'll start with the basic one, which is the flight search component spec. So this is more or less exactly the way how your Angular CLI also would generate the tests. So we see that we have here a before each, which is kind of an asynchronous function. This is executed every time or before every test. And we need to configure here our old test bed or our testing module with the help of our test bed. So even with standalone components, although ng modules are more or less optional, in testing, it's not really optional because we have still a testing module that we have to configure. But we see already that in the providers, we can already use the new provider functions. So instead of importing the HTTP client testing module or the router testing module, we see here already that we have, first of all, the provide HTTP client, which would kind of more or less provide the real HTTP client service itself. And then we kind of add the testing services here as well. So in the end, what this means for our tests is that there are no huge or no big changes. I mean, we still have the testing control available, so everything is still there. But the changes that we see here is that in the configuration of the testing module, we need to do some slightly different things. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I would say the same is also true for the router itself. So instead of using any testing module from the router, we just import or provide here the default router services, and then we have it the provide location mocks. That's the one that is used so that we don't make use of the complete routing module, but have some helper functions and all that stuff.
It really came as a surprise to me because normally we just provided the HTTP testing module or the router testing module, And now we have to provide the traditional stuff, provide HTTP client, provide router, and then we need another provider that overrides everything so that we can use it with the predefined mux.
Exactly, exactly. I don't know the reason why they have chosen to go that path. Yeah, there will definitely be a reason, but don't ask me. I don't know it. I just know you have to do it like it is shown here.
Yeah, I think it's fine. Once you know, you can align with this pattern.
Yes, 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 exactly. Yeah, and then we also have here the provider functions for NGRX. I mean, NGRX also upgraded very quickly. Actually, was one of the first third-party libraries that provided also some kind of a standalone API. So we see here we are providing the necessary services for NGRX to generate this so-called booking state, which is here part of the booking feature, along the booking effects as well. Yeah, the point here is the way how this testing module here is configured, that we also make full usage of NGRX. So NGRX is here at the moment not really mocked, it's just used by default, as it is. Yeah, then we have here the compile components. We also have before that we also have here the imports flight search component, and we can already now see a difference. So this is something what I would say is maybe the biggest change from standalone components to the old world, because before it was always a little bit, it wasn't that easy to import all the dependencies, because when normally you had an engine module that contained multiple components, so you could kind of import that engine module to test your component, but you also knew, now I'm having imports, now I have dependencies in my test where I know they are actually not part of the component. If you want to provide only those dependencies for this component, then the imports was a little bit lengthy. So there was no real ideal solution in my opinion. But now with standalone components, it's quite clear. As long as I say I want to use all the dependencies from that component, I only need to import the component and I have them there. If I say I want to mock some of the dependencies, then at the moment, it's a little bit, there are some obstacles. It's not that elegant, I would say, but we will come to that later. But for now, you see just importing the flight search component would already provide us, for example, with the flight card component that we don't even see here because it's not necessary. And after that, this is common stuff, I would say. This is known stuff. So we are creating the component, which returns us the component fixture. And depending on from the component fixture, we fetch here the instance of the component itself. And we start to run fixture detect changes, which is also the normal way how we do it. That means the component kind of activates itself, as I always like to call it, and the lifecycle hooks, especially the ng and init, for example, are executed. And then the component is kind of ready for usage. And we have here just one test. And we see already that this is a kind of a test. This is a very low-level test, I would call it, because we are not dealing here directly with the DOM. So we are not fetching any elements via the DOM. We are not calling any commands or dispatching any DOM events. We don't see this here. We are directly communicating with the component instance. This has the advantage that the tests are quite easy. But on the other side, it has the disadvantage that we can't really be sure if the component is tested, how should I say, if it's complete in its completeness, so to say. So the thing is, with our template, we should never forget the template isn't just a static string. In the template, there can be some directives, and the directives do have an impact in the way how the component works. So it even can add some logic to it. And the problem is always if we are not including the template, if we are not querying the elements via the DOM, then we might be missing something. For example, the most obvious use case is when we are having an ngF, where the ngF is kind of hiding a button or is hiding some input fields, then the properties of the components, they are there, so we can still set them as we do it right now. But if the template hides the field inputs or hides the input fields, it is still not working. So as I said before, there is always the risk that we might be missing here something.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this was the decision that was made here. And we see we are directly setting here the values to the properties. We are calling the search. So we are also calling directly the event handler, not clicking on the button. And then, of course, we would expect that the request happens initiated via NGRX. So the component should actually trigger an action or dispatch an action. It goes to NGRX, and somewhere in the effects, this search should take place. So we say here to the HTTP testing controller, I would expect that at this various moment, there is a request somewhere waiting, which goes to this URL. And if that's the case, please give me the request, and I'm going to answer it right now with request flush. So we return here a list containing 3 elements, which represent the flights. And then we go against our observable property. So the flights observable in this case, we are subscribing to it. And then we just verify that the flights that are emitted here, that it has a count of 3. This is what we do here. And at the very end, we just verify that no requests are open. Everything is closed more or less. And it's safe to finish more or less the test. Yeah. So as I said, a very simple test might fulfill the use cases. And yeah, there are, of course, also other variations. For example, there is this shallow test. Shallow testing is a very interesting testing technique, because shallow testing means that we might have a component that contains a lot of subcomponents. And then the problem is not really, I think, the subcomponents themselves. So I don't really care here that my flight search component has a flight card component. That's not really the problem. The problem is more the subdependencies of this flight card component. What services does it need? What further subcomponents does it inject? And the more components, the more subcomponents I have within my test, the more I'm losing control, because there is always the risk that I need too many of the dependencies in my test. And of course, this is not what I want. And because of that, we have here the possibility, or what this testing style does here, is that it kind of mocks the components themselves. So flight search component only has one component, which is the flight card component, and we mock it here. How can we mock it? That's actually very easy. We see the code right here. It's a simple class with a component decorator, standalone true. And the only thing that we have to make sure is that this component has the same selector as the original one. So the flight card, the real one, obviously also has the flight card selector. And then we just need to replace it in the testbed configuration. And this is what we see here. So not here. I mean, this is just a basic setup that we have already seen before. No change there. But here, this is the place where we're kind of replacing or mocking a dependency of a standalone component, which is not a service, but a visual element, as I like to call them. So this can be a component, a pipe, or a directive. And here we need, I mean, that's at the moment the only way how we can do it. I hope that in the future we are getting a better way, but at the moment we really have to override the component itself. And you see here, remove the flight card component, the original one, and then we just replace it with the mocked version. That's what we do here. And then, of course, the advantage is that when the flight card component would have some dependencies, we don't have to deal with them anymore, because the original one is not included here. Okay. Then we have the same kind of test again. But what we do now here is some kind of a mixture, because here we see that we are already going against the DOM. So here we're still dealing directly with the component with the TypeScript class itself. But here we go against the DOM, and we fetch all the DOM elements that contain the flight card as a tag. and we want to verify, and we verify that they are just 3 of them. But in order to do this, we have to control the change detection. So I have to say here fixture detect changes, because otherwise, of course, the data would be there. So the component instance or the flights observable, the property, it would kind of emit the flights. But if nobody tells Angular that it should maybe re-render the template, then the information is there, but it's not visually displayed, not re-rendered, and that's why we have to do it here this inside of our tests.
Can be painful.
Exactly.
I'm forgetting about this on a regular basis, and then I'm wondering why it does not work.
Yes. I think as everybody does. So this is one of the main pain points that we have in Angular testing, that we have to manually trigger the change detection. This is really, it requires from us a more knowledge about, maybe even about Angular rendering itself, or at least we have to know a little bit about the implementation. I need to know, okay, if I do this or if I do that, then I know that in my component something has changed. Angular is not aware of it because we are in a testing environment, and that's why I always have to run fixture detect changes. And of course, there are then also other things like the asynchrony, which we don't have here, luckily. But of course, if asynchrony also plays a big role, then we also have to kind of manage the asynchrony here as well. And then this just adds up in terms of complexity, and makes testing that hard as it is. Right, so this is the shallow testing. Then we have 2 further testing types. We have here one testing type where we don't mock a component, but where we mock the services. Or in this case, it's even NGRX. So we still see here our testing module with the common provider functions, but this time we have provide mock store and provide mock actions. So what we say here, that our store, our NGRX store, starts already with pre-existing flights, so it's already filled. And well, if we do this, then it's very likely that in our test we want to verify if these flights are shown when the component is more or less rendered. Right. So if we scroll down, we see already here these tests. So there is no further need to kind of set any properties, because the store has already the flights in it. So the only thing that we have to do in this case is that we just say, okay, look, when I subscribe to this observable, I want to verify, I want to see these 4 flights that I have specified in my testing module or in the provide mock store. And that's hopefully also the way how it is. Yeah, and then we also have another one, which is load flights. There we do a little bit more. Here we have again our subscription, but in addition, we don't kind of trigger the search via the component itself, but we directly dispatch the action, the load flights action, and then we hope that NGRX, as it has done it before, is starting to request from this URL here. We get the request, the request, of course. We also respond to it with the flush, as we've done already before, and then we verify here again that the flight's length should be 2. The thing here is that, again, we are not using here asynchrony. That's why it's a little bit easier, because if this controller here would kind of return an asynchronous observable, which it doesn't, so the testing controller by default also returns synchronous observables and not asynchronous ones, then we would also have to deal here with the asynchrony, as I've mentioned before. So even when you say, okay, we don't need to deal here with the DOM, but still asynchrony is in place, then it's, then we also have to manage it. Right. This was the NGRX kind of test where we mock NGRX itself, or where we could say we are mocking services. And then we have the router test. And here we see that we kind of have, again, the same testing setup. We've already provided this location mocks, this testing module for the routing module in all the other tests, but here we really make use of it. So what we're doing here in this test is that we verify if the URLs or if the href tags or even if the location more or less is really set. So we are actually looking here. I mean, we have already the existing flights, so we don't need to search. The flights should already be shown. And then we are looking for the A tags of the flight card, because if I go back to the application, there is always this edit button here. So if I click on it, I would come to this flight edit URL, and we search for them in this line here. So here I say I want to search for an A tag, which contains the class button default. Then I click on it, and then we see here asynchrony and change detection together. That's the way how it normally is especially when we add DOM and also when we add kind of full services to them, because most of the time they are asynchronous. So we have to run flush, we have to run detect changes, we have to make sure that we run them in the right order, because if we don't, the test will not work. And of course, if we forget to use one of them, then it's also not working.
Rings a bell somehow, yeah.
Yes. So in the beginning, I would say, and I think everybody had to go through that when you are kind of, when you don't really know anymore what you should do, that you just place these two commands between every command in your test and hope for the best. And then afterwards, you try to find out where you can remove them. Yeah, but of course, I mean, this is just something for the beginning. What I always say, you should really try to understand why it is now necessary and why it's not necessary, so that you don't add too many of these commands in your tests. I don't think it's a performance issue. It's kind of a readability issue. So when your tests have 10 flush commands in one test case, then yeah, it's kind of safe, but of course nobody can really read it or have to spend quite a lot of time to understand it. And this is of course something we want to avoid. Right. Yeah. So the final assertion that we saw here is really that the location, so the browser, the URL that we have more or less should be now this flight edit 1. And why does this actually work? Well, that works because we have defined here the route. So we said here, I'm not providing the complete routing configuration from my application. That would be unnecessary. I only provide these parts or these slices that are necessary for my test. And this is something I can do here with provide router, as we see it here. And it works quite nice, I would say. So by the way, I didn't run the test so far. So I just say this is this and that, but nobody really knows if they are actually working. So let me check that. Yeah, very fast. So yeah.
This was not part of the plan. Executing them was not part of the script.
Okay. Yeah, good work.
Yeah, everything is fine.
Yes. Okay, yeah, and that's what I call the native testing experience, where that the Angular CLI provides us. When you use an X, it is a little bit different, because then you have Jest and not Karma. But in the end, the way how the tests are written is more or less the same.
Awesome. That means there are some features that allow us to test those new standalone components. Some of them are still the same as before, like the testing module, and then there are some additional provider factories. Exactly. And when you reviewed this article, you told me, yes, it's nice, but there are some third-party vendor tools that make it a bit easier. And then you came up with another implementation of all those tests using the testing factory as well as the Cypress component test runner. Exactly. Can we have a look into those solutions?
Yeah, of course. So I'm just going to switch to the same project with my kind of changes. So what I introduced here was the testing library and also Cypress component test runner, as you just said. So maybe we'll just start with the testing library. And just there are two kind of topics that I want to discuss here. One is more about testing design. The other is really about the testing library itself. Before that, what's the testing library? What's the difference? So the testing library is first of all, it's actually it is more or less of a philosophy in the first sense, because what the testing library says, or what its inventor Kent Dodd says, is that you should always try to test your application, or should try to be as close as possible to your users. So this means you shouldn't go to the component instance, call directly event handlers, or set properties of your TypeScript class. You should really try to do this as your users do it. So you should input something into an input field. You should write something into an input field. You should click on a button. You should verify certain elements by looking at the screen, by using placeholders, by using labels, or just simple texts. And this gives you, first of all, in terms of testing, you are forced always to go via the DOM. Of course, it makes it harder, but you get more out of it. And it gives you more confidence, because you say, yeah, I've just clicked on the button that says search and I didn't call any event handler. So it's quite likely that the application is still working and not failing, because some directive did again something strange to the template. So the event handler never was actually executed and all that stuff. That's very unlikely to happen with the testing library. And the testing library exists for multiple frameworks. So it's very famous. It's very popular. It exists not just for Angular. It exists also for the major other single page application frameworks. So frameworks, more or less, front-end frameworks. And it also exists actually for Cypress. Although I'm not using here testing library with Cypress, I just split it apart. You don't have the testing library itself is not something which runs outside of the test bed, outside of the Angular testing rules. It runs on top of it. So you can't just say, I'm not interested how the test bed works, how the testing module works. I don't care about it because I'm using the testing library. No, that's not the case. You really have to understand how the native testing in Angular works. On top of it, you can then use the testing library. You will have an easier time writing your tests. But if you're running into edge cases, you always have to understand how Angular testing works at the bottom. So don't underestimate that. Right. And we have here already, I have just one file that runs with the testing library. And before I said, I also want to say something about the testing style, or about some certain patterns that I'm using here. So this is the first thing, maybe that's the one which is important. So I know already when I'm testing my flight search component that I have to deal more or less with the same elements all the time. So I know that I will definitely have to fill in some values into my input fields. I know that I have to click on the buttons, and I'm quite sure that at some point I need to query for the flight cards. So I don't want to rewrite all the selections all the time. And that's why I come up here with a UI variable where I kind of store the selectors of the testing library inside of it. So these are kind of functions. But the interesting thing is the way how they work. So we don't have here any selections via normal CSS selectors. We are really trying to do it as our real users also would do it. So I say here, I want to look out for some element that has a placeholder with from. I could also say I want to look out for an element that has assigned a label with from. This would also be possible. So I know already there must be something that contains the placeholder from, but of course also to. And the same is true for the button itself. But here We're not using a placeholder because obviously that's not available. But what we do here is that we are using a role. So what the testing library actually says, you should actually try to also test via accessibility criteria or to use selectors that would also work with a screen reader or something like this, where we actually use a role. And in HTML, the default is that we don't have to set the role explicitly. For buttons, and there is a list of predefined tags where the roles are set automatically. So I can just say here, okay, I want to select an element with the role button, and it should contain as label the name search. Could also use your regular expression, which I didn't, but again, this is way more closer to the user as if I would just call search directly from the component instance. And then about the flight cards, maybe not perfect, but just wanted to show that this is also possible. Test ID. These are actually, there are two opinions, kind of, let's call it opinions in the testing worlds, which kind of argue about the right approach. And the test ID is more or less the other opinion, which goes more or less against the way how the testing library wants it. Because the testing library says, the test ID. So what's the test ID? The test ID is a data attribute that I set directly in my HTML, which is a unique ID. And this, of course, has the advantage that it's completely independent when I'm going to switch the tags, or when I'm going to rewrite or to refactor my HTML structure. As long as the ID is set, the test is still working. But the problem is that the testing library says, the test ID is something our users don't see. And of course, our users will definitely not select or use the test ID as their criteria to select the elements. So we are not as close to the user as it is possible. The other party on the other side that kind of favor the test ID approach, they say, but with selecting via texts, it's good, but we always have to consider the amount of work, the amount of maintenance that might be necessary, especially in these cases where we have multilingual applications, so where the text can be different depending on the language our users are choosing. And it can also be the case that the texts are changing on a regular basis. And then I don't want to rewrite my tests all the time, and the test ID protects me from that. So these are these two different approaches that we have at the moment in testing all together here. So this is about the kind of placeholder, the predefined selectors that I am going to reuse all the time. The next important thing is that I don't use a before each method. So I don't automatically set up a predefined testing module here. What I do instead, it looks like similar, but it's not exactly the same. We see here that I have a setup method. The setup method is using the testing library to set up the testbed internally. So as I said before, testing library based on the testbed, all the rules apply here, but it abstracts it away from us. And the way how it does it is that it uses here a render function. But before we talk about what's here done internally, I want to explain why I'm using a setup method and not the before each. When we have a test case, then the problem is always the same. Our test case starts with a predefined configuration. It doesn't have any influence anymore. So in my test case, I can't say, hey, look, maybe I don't want to use the original NGRX. I want to use the mock store, or maybe I want to provide my own service instead of the store. That is not really possible because the configuration of the testing module is already done. The component has already been activated, even with fixture detect changes. So the test case can't change anything anymore. And this is, of course, not good because sometimes we have some subtle changes between the test cases. And then I kind of would have to rewrite a new testing configuration, which is not necessary if we go via the setup function here. Because what the setup function does, it says, yeah, I do more or less the same thing as the before each, but I don't run automatically. So every test case needs to call me from the perspective of the setup method. And this now has the advantage when the setup method is called by the test case, that the test case can provide some information to the setup method in terms of customization. So the test case could, for example, say, hey, look, I want to use a different service and I want to override it. I want to override the default configuration. This is possible, and I still want to use the rest of the configuration, whatever you might have. I also want to go with the default setup commands, setup instructions that you also do. This is possible here. So we see that in this case, we don't see it. We are just calling here the setup method. So there is no customization going on, but I think that somewhere later, where we have it, here, for example, here I say I want to kind of override the activated route service, and I don't want to come up with any complete new or with my own testing module configuration. It's just about that service. And because the test now calls the setup method, it is possible that I provide here my own service from the test case. This is the advantage. Of course, and if I don't do anything, if the test case doesn't provide anything or doesn't pass any providers to it, then the setup method just goes with the default values, as we see here, default providers. Yeah. So this is about the setup method, and now about the testing library itself. So as we've seen it already, there is this render method. The render method, you can see there's a wrapper method around testbed, create, configure testing module, and also create component, and also detect changes. So it does all the things that are necessary to set up, instantiate a component in one command. And what does it have? What does it need? This kind of information, or what is necessary? Well, of course, first of all, I need to define what kind of component I actually want to test. So this is clear. It can't know it. This is something we have to do in our test. And then we have the render method, the render options, and they are more or less the same parameters with some additional extra features, but they are the ones that are then passed on to the configure testing module. So we see already here the providers property. We can also use the imports, which is not necessary because when I want to use the flight search component, it's obvious that somebody needs to import it. So I don't have to do this here additionally. And then we have some other things. You see here component providers, component properties. You can do quite a lot of stuff. You can even say, I don't want you to run the change detection immediately because maybe I want to override a property before you run the onInit method and that stuff. So for some edge cases, there is some customization possible. But very short. So this is when you compare this, what we have seen before with testbed configure testing module. That's it. This is just one command. And then we move on. So the testing library, as I've mentioned before, is very popular. And that means that it also has a rich ecosystem with a lot of plugins. Maybe not a lot of, but very useful plugins. One of them is the user event. The user event is used when we for mouse clicks, when we want to fill in inputs, when we want to do some other user-based stuff. And what the user event does, that it tries to emulate exactly the same behavior as we would find with real users. So for example, when I say I want to type something into an input field, normally in Angular, it would be enough if I dispatch the input event. But what the user event library does, it triggers or it dispatches all events that also happen with a real user. Because I have to focus, then there's a key down, a key up, a key press, whatever, even a blur at the very end. And it also does some internal checks if an input field is actually re-accessible. So for example, if it is not hidden or something like this. So what I always say is when you use the testing library, which is of course something that I recommend, don't just go only with the testing library, but also use or check out the plugins that they have, and definitely go with the user event. And by the way, the placeholders here that I used before, they are also coming from a plugin that's actually how's it called? The testing library selector. So that's the name of the library that kind of provides me that functionality. Yeah. What else? So of course I can also have direct access to Angular's dependency injection. We see this here, testbed inject. I can do that. Why not? It's not forbidden. And I create here kind of a utility function because I know that my input fields, they have already some default values. So when I want to type in something, I need to clear them first, and only then can I run this user type, which would type in the actual value. So that's why I created here the set value function that first clears it and then afterwards types something in. Right, and together with the render result, which is the return value of the render function itself, together with that, I'm returning the user. So this is kind of this user event object, the HTTP testing controller, and the set value. So when our tests are executing setup method, they have everything already available, all the functionality that they actually need. Right. Something I wanted to say about the render result. What's that? The render result, you can see it as a kind of a mixture between things that the testing library provides you and also a little bit the component fixture in Angular. So the render result, for example, we see here there is a debug element, there is this fixture. We even have a detect changes that we will call, although in most cases we don't need it because the testing library does all of that for us. And yeah, of course, then we have here a lot of finders that we can then also use. It's kind of a mixture, as I said before. Good. Then let's come to our first test. And this test kind of triggers a search and verifies that 5 flight cards are more or less shown. So setup method, I've already explained it. And then you see here the usage of the set value. So I say I want to set the value to the input from. I want to set the value to the input to. And then I want to click on the button submit. So I'm combining here set value internally uses the user event. The user itself is coming from the user event. So I'm combining here the user events together with the selectors, and where the testing library now comes into the game more or less is that the testing library internally is dealing with the change detection and also with the asynchrony if there would be some. This is one of the main benefits of the testing library, although this is also very good, what we see here with the user events. But I mean, you see here, every test is an asynchronous function. And I'm running all these commands with an await, because internally, the testing library checks if asynchronous tasks have been scheduled. And if that's the case, it just runs them inside of the command. So I don't have to execute a tick anymore. It's not necessary. And the same is true for the for the change detection. So that's also executed by the testing library itself. So everything that I have to care about is just executing the necessary actions, the user actions, and the testing library, in most cases, takes care of the rest. And in the most cases, as I said, it's really the asynchrony and the change detection. And sometimes, which we don't see here and which we also haven't seen in the test before, also about dispatching the right DOM events. Because especially with input elements, if we are not dispatching the right DOM events, then the form control internally is not aware that a value has been set, and then it's also not working. So this is actually the third thing that I encounter quite often with native testing, that I have to know a little bit about the DOM events that this component is dispatching. And yeah, as I said before, because maybe the form control is listening to them. And if I miss that, then of course it's again not really working. You're right. So controller, this is just the normal testing controller from the HTTP client testing module or from the provider function. And yeah, there is something new here as well, which is the create flights command. This is something that I do quite often. I really like this approach. This is again a helper function for my domain models, for my domain types, because especially, I mean, with large applications, we are dealing with domain types that might contain a little bit more than just the 5 properties. And of course, I don't want to rewrite the complete flight all the time. Maybe I can get away with an empty object, but sometimes, and maybe it's not sometimes, but quite often, our services kind of would say, yeah, there must be a from value set, or there is some internal validation going on where some values have to be present. And of course, if that's not the case, then it's again failing. And that's why I always create this kind of utility functions that are generating me a domain type based on an existing template, which I can very easily override. So we see here that the create flight method is a partial of the actual flight. So I can always provide different values. So if I say I don't want that the flight which is generated, it shouldn't contain Graz because I want to verify against London or something else, and I just need to provide an object literal with a from property, and I don't need to care about the rest that the flight property, that the flight object also is requires, and that's very helpful in that case. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's just called here create flights. It's the accompanying method, and it generates me not 5 empty objects, but 5 fully equipped, can't say equipped, but 5 flight objects more or less, which contain some values. Right, and here again, the await screen find all by test ID. As we know from before, this fetches me all the flight cards. Again, I don't need to care about the change detection. Everything is done by the testing library. I just need to provide the await. This is important. There are also other methods. You could say get all by test ID or query all by test ID, but they are synchronous methods. One fails if the element is not there. The other one returns you a null if the element is missing, and they don't care about the change detection. So what I always say, go with the find methods. They give you the best features that the testing library provides. Good. So that's it about that test. Then we have the mocked version where we say we don't want to deal with the original flight card anymore. We want to use a mocked version. And here again, I'm also using something new, which we haven't seen before. Because before we have created our own mocked version of the flight card component. So if you remember, these were these 10 lines or so where we regenerated this component. And here we have just a function. This is called the mock component function. And to be fair, this is not something coming from the testing library, but here I'm using a third library, a third-party library, which is called ngmocks. So ngmocks can be used to mock not just components, but also pipes, directives. You can even mock services if you want, although there are also other libraries available. Also, the testing library has something for that. But for components on component level, I really like to use the ngmocks. It also works already with standalone components. But in this case, I just say, yeah, just mock the flight card component, and I'm done with it. We see here that we are also overriding the component itself. So that we're using test bed override component. What does it do? Internally, of course, it's not magic. It has to find out the selector of the original method. It's regenerating another object, and it also contains all the input and output properties from the original as well, but of course not in their original implementation, but just in the mocked version. So I don't even know what they are returning, what an event returns, but at least if you say you have some kind of property binding to a flight card component, the properties will be there, and you can even access them. Yeah, and except that, the test is just the normal thing as it was already before. So it's just here the mocking version. Right, and then we have these tests where we dealt with the routes in some way. So what we do here is that we want to verify if the parameters, search parameters, the from and the to, if they are set already in the URL, then we want that the search is triggered kind of automatically. And this is what we see here, if I'm not mistaken, but I think that's the case. So what I do here is that I am not using any existing mocking libraries from Angular itself, because what I say here, in the end, it's just the activated route service that needs to provide some parameters as an observable. This is, so I need to know a little bit about the implementation details. So I need to know, yeah, it's actually the component internally accesses the observable and not goes via the snapshot. If I miss this, then of course the test is not working. But yeah, we see here just again the power of the setup method. I can use I can go with one setup method only, and I just need to add here my additional service that I want, can customize it in any way that I want, and then the test is just working. So I say here, I want to verify that it's also Vienna to London and not just, I don't know what it is, Graz to something else. And then I also verify, of course, here if the HTTP request happens.
Nice.
Yep. And then we have the other part, which I didn't mention before, the second described block. Because what I did is that I said, looking at the tests that we had, there are some tests that kind of trigger a search request, and there are some tests that don't. And there is a difference in terms of the setup of the testing module. And I didn't want to write multiple files because it wasn't necessary. I mean, I have here around 155 lines of code that's still readable for a testing file. So I don't want to put them all in one file. But of course, because I have these two different configurations, I said I use a nested describe. This is also possible. So you can, instead of placing our testbed configuration or the testing module configuration in the first describe, I just create another layer and there I add them. This is, yeah. It's also sometimes, this is called the context. So there are some testing libraries, some testing frameworks available where you could kind of say here context. And I even think even with Jasmine, it might be possible. No, that's Mocha. Yeah, but no, most cases I'm not using Jasmine. So in Jest, it's just described 2 times. But yeah, doesn't matter. The important thing is that you can nest them. Right. And yeah, you see here before each. Why do I use here before each? Well, because it's not necessary to use a setup function. So it's not necessary that my tests need to apply some kind of customization. That's why I get away here with the before each. The differences are that I set up here the flight edit route, this information, because I will have a test that verifies the link as it was before. And I also want to work with a mocked version of NGRX that we see here with the provide mock store. So if I start with the first test, I say flights are available. So we have 3 of them. Here we see actually a variation where I am kind of providing some data to it, because I mean I'm not testing it in this test here. But here I said I want that it is Vienna to London, and I don't want to rely on the default values. So this is the way how it works, and I don't care about the 2 others. It's just be the default values, and I'm fine with that. Right, and then we are just have here again our screen find all by test ID function, where we say there must be flight cards already there when the component is initialized or is rendered the first time. This is what this test here verifies. And then we have a second test also looks very similar, what we have seen already, with one exception. We have here a within command. So what we do here is that we say it is some kind of a nested selection. So I say I go to the flight card, and from my flight card, from the one that I've already fetched, I want to go down and I want to fetch another DOM element, which is a child of it. And this is something I can do here within with this within command. You're right. And then I just, since this is a normal DOM element, I'm verifying that the href attribute is more or less that one here. And then I'm also done. So I think the real power or the benefit that we're getting from the testing library is, first of all, that we have here a lot of utility functions that allow us to select elements by using criteria as our real users also would do it. So when I say I want to look for a button with the placeholder or with a label, that's very easily possible. There are functions for that. And the other advantage is, of course, that I don't, in most cases, can't give you a percentage, but let's just say 90 or 95 or 99, depending on the application, of course. You don't have to deal with the change detection, with the asynchrony, and you don't have to know which DOM events you need to dispatch, especially if you use the user event. So that's
really nice. Yeah.
Yes.
You don't have to abandon all those technical stuff. You just describe it. It's more or less a script that tells us what the user should do if a user would test it.
Exactly. So I always like to say it's very near to the way how we write actually end-to-end tests. They read a little bit like this. We don't see, as you said, we don't see so much code in terms of technical details like change detection or asynchrony. That's all hidden away. It's not there, and we can really focus on the actual actions that we want to do in this test.
Awesome. And then you told me we can further simplify all of this by going with the Cypress component test runner.
Exactly. So I actually, even if this is wonderful what the testing library provides us, by the way, there's also Spectator, which is very similar to the testing library. It also has this kind of abstraction and makes it very easy to write tests. But
I think we have an issue with audio. We don't hear you anymore. We still don't hear you. Oh, you are muted. You're muted now for some reason.
Yes.
Now we hear you. Yeah.
And so I just heard it from my earphones that I can't hear myself anymore. I'm listening into myself as well. Yeah. No, so there was some kind of contact issue with my microphone. Yeah, but if you can hear me now, it's fine.
Perfect. You need to share your screen once again.
Yes.
And here we go.
Wonderful.
Recursion.
Good. Yeah, so I was about to start with Cypress component testing. Before I said before that there is also Spectator, which is also a very similar library like the testing library, also some kind of abstraction and also quite useful. But with Cypress, it's even better because the way how it works, Cypress says, I give you all the instruments that you have already available in end-to-end testing. So in Cypress, for example, it's this superior user experience that we can really see our application and all these awaiting features. So it is again something about asynchrony that we don't have to deal with. When it comes to the change detection, it's not necessary. Why? Because it's just a normal Angular component or an Angular set of components not running within a testing context, but just running in the browser itself. It's the Angular application running in the browser. So it just detects itself. So change detection runs automatically. And of course, because I'm directly interacting with the browser, I also have the same DOM events as they are also when you use a browser. So this is quite good. And what Cypress did is that they said, I give you all these features, all these nice things, and you don't need to run, or you don't need to start the complete application. You don't need to set up everything. What we provide, you can do more or less do the same thing that you do already with your existing component unit tests, however you want to like to call them, and you can run parts of your application, not your complete application, but just you can pick what component along services, and you can run them and test them with Cypress. And this is what the Cypress component tester is all about. The way how it works is that we just need to run Cypress as we would normally do it. And since version 10, Cypress said we don't consider ourselves as a pure end-to-end testing framework anymore. We also see ourselves as a component testing framework. So they kind of went a little bit down in terms of the testing library and tried also to serve the needs for component testing. They have direct integration into Angular. So again, depending what you're running on, if you're using the Angular CLI, there are schematics for that. Just run the official Cypress schematics and everything will be fine. And if you run on NX, then NX takes care that everything's working. Right. Mm-hmm. So I say here, I want to do component testing, not end-to-end testing. And then we see the known screen of Cypress, more or less. And Cypress already found that there is a testing file available. We see this here via the extension SciTS. Before we look into the code, I just execute them. So I just need to click on them. And we see something. So this is already the first big benefit, big improvement, that we see our real flight search. And again, this is not because the application is running. Cypress just took the component, depending on what we've defined in our tests, from our application source code, hosted it into an internal web server, did all the compilation that the Angular CLI also does, and provided some kind of an address where we can kind of test the component on our own. And this is what we see here. And it comes with all the benefits of Cypress. So I can, for example, click here on a testing file, and I can hover with my mouse over the various test commands, and then I see how my component changed by command, or with every command. So we see here there was a type and all that stuff. So if you do end-to-end testing, then this is something that you already know. It's as I said before, it's in the end, it's just end-to-end testing, but not against a running application, but against the component itself. Mm-hmm. So this is how it looks like. So very easy to also to debug, to find out if there was an error and all that stuff. And if we take a look at our tests, we see that they are even easier to understand, even easier also to write than the testing library. So let me open it. So SciTest, this is the flight search component. One thing that kind of might make it a little bit hard, but not in comparison to the testing library or to the native testing, but in comparison to the end-to-end testing, we need to come up with the testing module here as well. So, I mean, that's clear. I am doing component testing, so there will be some parts where I say this is something I want to mock. And for these parts, I want to use the original implementations. Yeah, this is up to us. We need to decide what we want to do. And this has to be done via the testing module. So we see here kind of the same things that we have seen already before. We have here the default providers. So we have providers that we need to come up with. And the nice thing here is we actually don't have to use the HTTP, the testing functionalities of Angular itself, because Cypress provides, in my opinion, superior ones. So the intercept command is way better than the testing controller that Angular provides us. So that's why I just say here, come on, just use the HTTP client, the real one, and try to send out something to the endpoint. I will catch it via Cypress. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so setup method, as we have seen it before with the render function or with test bed configure testing module. We just provide here everything which is necessary. So I say here, this is what I want to test. This is the flight search component. So testbed create component is here internally called. And I come up here with my configuration. So I say, yeah, these are the providers. And of course, because that's a standalone component, flight search component, the flight card, I didn't change it here in any way. The flight card is here also included. And again, if the flight card would again contain some other things, they would also be here part of the test.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then we see here already how the intercept command works. So that's the alternative to the testing controller. I should say here I want to intercept, actually very similar, but way more powerful. We don't see here all the details, but I just say here, yeah, that's the URL I would expect, and then just return that response. So in the body, it has create flights. You already know what create flights does, and that should do it. Mm-hmm. There is one difference to the testing controller, which I personally find a little bit annoying. That is that with the testing controller, I always have to define its behavior after the request has already been sent. And normally, if I'm dealing with mocks, I do it before. So I need to define the behavior of a mock before it is actually called. With the client, it's different. So it's a little bit unintuitive for me. But here with the intercept command, it is as I know it, I would say. Yeah, and these are already the commands. So again, of course, with Cypress, we always go via the DOM. We never go directly to a component's property or call an event listener. And these are the normal commands. So scigget, if you see this for the first time, scigget gives you possibilities to select a DOM element. So I say here input name from, I clear it, and I type something in. I do the same with to. In the end, I click on the submit button, and then I just verify if the 5 flight cards are actually shown. And yeah, we don't have to deal here. I don't need any wait. This is all built into Cypress. It takes care of the asynchrony as long as every action can be fulfilled within 5 seconds. 4 seconds, sorry, there are differences in terms of network output, timeouts, and that stuff. But it can an acceptable amount of time, let's put it like this, the test will work. Of course, you can also customize it if you want. But as I said before, that's even more readable than it was already in the testing library.
Nice.
Yeah. And yeah, we also then can continue with other types of tests. I mean, we can of course also use the ng mocks if we find it necessary to mock a component. We can also use the testbed here. So testbed override component. It's the same rules. It's what I always say is it's kind of the setup for the testbed is always kind of the same, regardless if you use the testing library, Cypress, or the native ones. I mean, yeah, maybe some commands you don't have to type so much, but the logic is more or less the same. But when it comes to the actual test execution, this is where especially TypeScript really is wonderful, because it just takes care of everything, and we can really just focus on what we want to do. So what we see here, for example, is not just that we are mocking a component. Here I will also want to verify that this network request is kind of executed. So I store here that request under an alias, which I call search request. And at the very end, I just verify that this search request actually happened. So if this would not be the case, and for some reason the flight cards are shown because they have already been before in the store, then this test will also fail, because it says, yeah, nice that I see 5 flight cards, but they are definitely not coming from this request, because that one never happened.
Cool.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, and yeah, activated routes. I mean, this is more or less the same thing we have already seen before with the testing library. It's kind of, I just rewrote more or less the same tests with the testing library in Cypress again, but just by scrolling over them, we can see the advantage that it's just easier when it comes to the commands. Everything is easier with Cypress in that sense. At the very end, this is something I don't like. yeah, maybe we don't. It's a question what you want to test. Maybe if we say, okay, it's not necessary to test the routes, it's more important that there is some kind of header or some kind of form shown. This is where you can edit your flight. I'm already satisfied. But here the decision was that we want to verify against the location itself. It works but we don't click on it. So what we do here, we just verify that the A tag has the right, or that the href attribute has the right value, and then we just imply that the browser knows what an href tag is doing, not the tag, but what an A tag is doing when we click on it. So we're not
Most
testing
of them
that.
no effort.
Yes, I've heard this. Yes, they are quite good in following links. Exactly. And then we just expect that everything is working.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the Cypress component testing. I mean, this is something what I would say the advantages are here really, it's more or less obvious. I mean, maybe not just by looking at the code, but also looking at Cypress itself as the test runner. It's obvious why you want to do it. You just have a much better developer experience. You also see the things. And there are even some use cases which can be done in Cypress, but not in the other ones. For example, and this doesn't apply in this case to the testing library, but there are some cases where we say, for example, when a button is hidden in a way, then that our other ones, that they are kind of working. For example, I could say the search button here is invisible. This is something I could do. The consequence of it is, of course, that the DOM element of the button is still there. It's just invisible. As a user, I can't click on it. But our test cases that go directly against the DOM, they will find the DOM element, and they will say, yeah, of course, I can dispatch the click event on this DOM element. This is something that I can do. Then the test turns green. And in the end, our users will tell us, yeah, it's wonderful that you have 2 input fields, but where should I click to trigger the search? This is something that only Cypress kind of can do. So if I go, for example, to my flight search component, and where do we have not the delay, but where is the search? Here it is. No, where is it? Search found. Here it is. If I say here, display hidden, visibility hidden, I think it is. If I run now Cypress, it will tell me there is a problem because the button, it is there. Yeah, it's there, but it is hidden. So there are some additional checks that Cypress does. I mean, in the end, Cypress knew that the DOM element was there, but it said, yeah, you can't click on it. It's not possible. I mean, you can enforce it by setting false to true, but do you really want to do this? Because your users will not be able to set this attribute here. And yeah, other testing frameworks might not come up with this because they don't have these additional checks built in. So if I would, for example, do the same thing with our Jasmine test that we have seen before. So this old example here. And of course, I would have a problem. Or not. It depends, of course. I mean, the various testing frameworks that are, of course, also learning. Everybody is checking out what the others are doing. For example, the testing library has already something built in, but I'm not sure about Jasmine. But in the end, I mean, it
still works.
Yeah, it works. Yeah, that's the problem, and it's clearly not possible. Testing library, I think, would have this issue with a button, but not with input fields if you use the user events, what I do. And even I think with user event click, so the user event, this library, this plugin of the testing library has some checks built in that would kind of recognize that there is an error or that there is an issue with this button and would fail. Yeah, right. And that's it so far from my side.
Awesome. Yeah, that's Really feels good. That's really a nice approach towards testing a component.
Yeah, definitely is.
So you're really an insider in the world of testing, especially when it comes to testing SPA applications. So what's new in that area?
Yeah, quite a lot of things are happening, I would say. So, I mean, we saw this already with the Cypress component tester. This is something really new. Um, as I said, it will be interesting to see how the landscape will look like in a year or so, because people are also discovering it. Of course, it's obviously about the advantages, and of course, Cypress is not the only one. So, for example, Playwright, the number one competitor, as I like to call it, also already provides component testing, but not for Angular. But the thing is, there is somebody else in the Angular community who kind of has already a proof of concept, given some limitations, some constraints, where it is possible to test something in Playwright. So if we pick this up and we follow it, then maybe we have already two existing or former end-to-end frameworks where we can also run component tests against it. And then for me personally, it's how should I say? If we take a look at NX, for example, I mean, NX says we will provide you with the best tooling for Angular available, and it's common. It's not just something that NX says; it's something that everybody kind of says. That Jest is better than Jasmine because it runs faster. This was actually the main reason why Jest came out, because Jest actually was in the beginning Jasmine. The problem now is that the more our frameworks or the more our libraries are built on top of native ECMAScript modules, the more issues Jest has, because Jest can't, by default, not directly deal with ECMAScript modules. And if you don't customize the Jest configuration, and that's not easy, that's really hard, you run into performance issues. The tests with Jest tend to be already slower than the ones with Jasmine. Not because Jest is slower, it's all about the missing support for ECMAScript modules. And this is not something new. I mean, if this is something which appeared a month ago, I would say, yeah, they will fix it. But this is already more than a year where this is a known thing. And yeah, they are working on it. But the problem is, I mean, at some point in time, it has to be fixed. And of course, we as application developers, we need a solution. So I can say, okay, I can survive 1 or 2 or I don't want to say half a year, just some number with that not optimal performance if I have a kind of a promise or if I have the perspective that just comes up and fixes it. But yeah, I don't know how to say it, but it's already a very long time. And at the same time, we also see that this new generation of new Node.js tools that are rewritten not in JavaScript, but in a different programming language like Rust or Go, that they are coming and coming and coming. And there is also in the testing ecosystem, there is retest, which is a rebuild I never know the programming language. Is this Go or Rust or one of these two? But the point is, it's way faster, and it's also fully compatible with Jest. So all the commands are running there, and we see already that the newer generations of the front-end frameworks, they have it already built in by default. And it's just a question of time until it's fully compatible with Angular. Again, a little bit with some constraints. And again, somebody from the community is already working on retest support for Angular. That's Brendan Roberts with his Analog project. And yeah, I planned to give it another try. I mean, I tried already several months ago, but I want to give it another try if it's now already works more stable, especially if we say component testing is not something I have to do with Jest anymore. So what's left for Jest are basic unit tests, where I maybe just instantiate a class, run some methods against the class, and that's it. And every time I need to interact with the DOM, I go to Cypress or to the testing library, whatever. Maybe more to Cypress, and then the usage or the need for jest is very limited. And then I can think, because I don't need so many features of this testing framework, that I can go directly with retest. And then, yeah, I mean, I'm happy. But of course, jest, not so much, I would say. And yeah, so this is something which is currently, I would say, in development. This is something which is currently going on in the background. And yeah, it will be interesting to see how it continues. I mean, it can also happen that just tomorrow says, yeah, everything's fixed. You can run your tests again, but it's very interesting time.
Mhm. Cool. So what's about Playwright component testing? Is there something that is coming up?
Yeah. So coming up. So the thing is with Playwright is that they say they will only provide component testing for frameworks that can run on Vite. Angular has some issues, as we know. Again, a reference to this analog project. This is one, could be one use case. The other one is these versatile components that comes from this experiment from Eunice JD. And he said, this is this proof of concept that I've talked about before. He says, when you're using all the new features, so the inject function, not the constructor, if you use inline all the time, if you do that, then it should be possible to use Playwright, or at least he has a running concept, a running proof of concept for that. And if that's the case, I mean, we all know the inject function is recommended by the Angular team itself. Inline, so single file components is also a thing at the moment, that you say, okay, you don't necessarily need these huge components anymore if you can keep them very small. So I can think that maybe Playwright component testing for Angular will be available much faster as it looks at the moment.
So another thought is we have now something like Playwright and also Cypress for end-to-end testing, for component testing. So what if those tools would also support unit testing? Then we would have one solution for literally everything.
Yes. That's very interesting. I mean, I know from Cypress that they have actually plans to do that. So Cypress has a history of also providing itself as a unit testing framework. And well, since they have plans, it will be interesting to see how this turns out. But what I know, the thing with Cypress is that it doesn't run on Jest or on Jasmine. So you have a lot of libraries at the moment that are kind of based on Jest or Jasmine. For example, the mocking library. So there is, for example, Jasmine Autospice. There is ngMocks that I have mentioned. There are several others, and you know already how to write mocks and unit tests. With Cypress, that's different because Cypress doesn't run on Jest anymore. It's using, as far as I know, Xenon, which is the kind of mocking functionality that Cypress is based on. And well, these are new commands, so you need to learn something new. Of course, your existing tests have to be rewritten. Yeah, the other thing, of course, is, do you really want to be fully dependent on Cypress? I mean, this is also a question. I mean,
I see.
Yeah, but definitely interesting as well. Yeah.
A last thing we've prepared is your answer to a question we got quite frequently in the last time. It's about this new inject function, this newly discovered inject function that you described before or talked about before. Namely, the question is how to test it, how to test something that is using inject.
Yes. So the thing about the inject function or testing with the inject function is, as long as you use the testbed, you don't have any problem, because the testbed provides you the complete dependency injection, and then regardless if your class is using a constructor or the inject function, it just works. Also mocking and all that stuff, that's not a problem. But of course, in unit tests, we say, why do I actually need to test the test bed in the first place? Because it's a component. I just instantiate it on my own. In the past, I'd create my mocked services, provided them in the constructor, and then everything was perfect. Of course, a direct construction, a direct instantiation of a class in the test is way faster, or should be way faster than, let's say I have testbed configure testing module where behind the scenes quite a lot of code will definitely be running. So if speed is a very important thing, then you will go with directly instantiating your objects on your own. But yeah, with the inject function, then you have a problem, because the inject function needs an existing dependency injection where you again need to use the testbed. So there are two options or three. So you just go with the testbed and hope for the best. I mean, the testbed is quite fast, so it might not be a problem as it used to be in the past. Angular has invested also some time in improving it. Don't know in which version. I think in 12 or 11 there was already a significant performance boost. The other thing is that you can use a spy on the inject function, which is very ugly, because you have to kind of place or add a spy against the Angular framework itself, which doesn't look really nice, but that works. It works. So this is a way how you can very easily say, yeah, although the component is using an inject function, I can still instantiate on my own. And then my spy just takes over the dependency injection. That is a possibility. A variation of that would be that you say, I don't want to mock the inject function, but then you just create a wrapper function that you use inside your application code. So the wrapper function can be called di or something else, and it internally calls the inject function. So it just is a proxy. But because it is a wrapper function, you can then mock that wrapper function and provide all the functionality that you need. So this is also possible. And the last one is that we're currently working on a library which is based on the spy approach, but you don't see it. So it's hidden away from you. It's also making sure that when the test is done, that the restore of the original inject function is done in the right way, in the correct way, so that you don't have any influences to other tests or something goes bad. But this is something which is work in progress, I would say.
Could be worth another recording once it's
Definitely, yes.
Awesome. Yeah, lots of great insights. So thanks, Rainer, for your time. It was really amazing to see all those possibilities.
You're welcome. It was also funny for me. Yeah, thanks.
I thank you, and have a nice day. And also you in front of the camera. See you again.
Goodbye.
Bye.